It was late autumn when I went camping alone for the first time. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, but that one was different somehow. The air was colder, the days shorter, and the woods felt emptier than usual. I'd picked a quiet spot deep in a forest reserve about an hour from town, a place I'd been to a few times before with friends. The trail wasn't heavily used, and by the time I hiked a couple of miles in, I hadn't seen another person all afternoon. That was exactly what I wanted. Just silence, trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the dry branches. I reached my campsite as the light began to fade. The clearing was small, with enough room for my tent, a small fire ring made of stones, and a couple of fallen logs I could use as benches. Beyond that, the trees pressed in tightly on every side. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving behind a carpet of brown and orange that crunched under every step. I gathered firewood before it got too dark, using what I could find close by: dry branches, some bark, bits of kindling. Once the fire was going, I settled into that kind of quiet that only happens deep in the woods. The sound of the flames filled the stillness, popping and crackling as sparks drifted upward into the blackness. The sky above was clear, and through the bare branches I could see the stars shining faintly. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I sat watching the fire. After a while, I started to notice how absolute the silence was. No distant traffic, no voices, not even the usual insects or owls that you'd expect at night. Just the steady sound of the fire and the occasional whisper of wind. It was peaceful in a way, but it also felt strange, like the woods were holding their breath. I cooked a small meal, drank a beer, and let my mind drift. It must have been close to midnight when I decided to put another log on the fire before crawling into my tent. That's when I first noticed it, a faint orange flicker somewhere through the trees. It looked like another fire, far enough away that it barely showed between the trunks, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't just moonlight. My first thought was that maybe someone else was camping out there, maybe another hiker who'd set up nearby. For a while, I just sat watching it. The flicker was steady, not moving much, but it seemed too low to the ground to be a lantern or flashlight. It looked like another campfire. I told myself that made sense. There were other campsites in the area, though not many. Still, something about the light bothered me. It wasn't bright or warm looking, just a dull orange glow pulsing faintly between the trees. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I decided I'd walk a little closer, just to see where it was coming from. I grabbed my flashlight, left my fire burning low, and headed in that direction. The ground was covered in dry leaves that crunched with every step, the sound echoing in the quiet night. As I moved deeper into the trees, the glow grew brighter, but the forest around it stayed unnaturally still. After a few minutes of walking, I came to a small clearing. The smell hit me first, an acrid, heavy scent that didn't quite smell like wood smoke. It was thicker, sharper. My flashlight beam cut through the smoke and caught the edge of a small fire burning low in a circle of stones, much like my own. But what froze me in place was what was next to it. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. There was a shape by the fire sitting upright, perfectly still. For a split second, I thought it was someone sitting there watching the flames. Then I realized the person wasn't moving. The shoulders were slumped slightly, the head tilted downward, and there was no sound, no breathing, nothing. I took a slow step forward, the leaves crackling under my boots, and the smell grew stronger. It wasn't just wood smoke. It was the smell of burnt fabric, maybe hair. My stomach tightened as I aimed my flashlight directly at the figure. The light caught pale, blistered skin and a dark mass of charred clothing. My brain didn't want to believe it at first, but there was no mistaking it. It was a person. The body was half burned, the face turned away from me. One arm was stretched toward the fire as if reaching into it. The skin was cracked and blackened in places, the hair gone. I felt my knees weaken as I realized I wasn't walking up on a campfire. I was walking up on what was left of someone who had burned themselves alive. I didn't know what to do. I stood there frozen, listening to the faint hiss of the dying fire. The body didn't move. The flames just licked at the remaining wood, throwing a dim light across the clearing. My hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight beam jittered across the trees. It was clear that whoever it was had been there a while, probably through the night. The ground around the fire was scorched, and the air was thick with the smell of burned flesh. I could see a melted metal canteen and what looked like a backpack lying a few feet away. The scene was quiet, too quiet, like the forest itself was keeping its distance. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. My mind was racing with what to do next. There was no cell service where I was, and it was the middle of the night. The nearest ranger station was miles away. I remember turning in a slow circle, the beam of my light sweeping across the empty woods, half expecting to see someone else there. But there was nothing, just me, the trees, and that awful smell. I didn't even go back to my own camp. I left everything, my tent, my pack, my half-burned fire, and started walking back toward the trailhead. Every step I took felt unreal, like I was walking through a dream I couldn't wake up from. The forest seemed darker now, heavier, like the air itself was pressing against me. Every sound made me flinch, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I just kept walking, focusing on the faint outline of the trail under my feet. It took me over an hour to reach the parking area. My truck was the only vehicle there, the metal cold to the touch as I opened the door. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. The image of that burned figure wouldn't leave my mind. The way it had been sitting so still by the fire, as if it had simply decided to stay there forever. When I finally got enough of a signal on my phone, I called the local authorities. My voice shook as I explained where I'd been, what I'd seen. They told me to wait at the ranger station nearby, and a few hours later I was giving a statement to a pair of deputies who looked as tired as I felt. They said they'd go out to the site and check, asked me to point out on a map where the clearing was. Later, I learned they did find the remains exactly where I'd said. It had been a man, though they didn't release much more than that. They found a note near his pack, but no one told me what it said. Probably a suicide, they said, though the exact cause of death was listed as self-inflicted burns. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to stumble on during a camping trip. For weeks after that, I couldn't get the smell out of my nose or the image out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dull orange firelight flickering between the trees. I thought about how quiet the woods had been that night, how still everything was, and how close I'd been without even realizing it. I haven't gone camping alone since. The woods don't feel the same anymore. What used to be peaceful silence now feels heavy, like something unseen is always there. Every time I see a fire burning low in the dark, I think about that night. The faint glow through the trees, the smell of smoke, the stillness of the figure beside the fire. People talk about the woods like they're calm, beautiful, even healing. But out there, when it's just you and the dark, the silence can turn on you fast, can hold things you're not ready to see. And sometimes, when the fire burns low and the world goes quiet, it can hide the most brutal truths of all. I went camping alone in a valley that was tucked deep between two long ridges, the kind of place where your phone loses signal halfway down the dirt road. I had gone there to spend a few quiet nights by the river, away from the noise of everything. It was late in the season, not quite winter, but cold enough that nights dropped below freezing. I had planned the trip for weeks, loaded up my old pickup truck with my tent, sleeping bag, a cooler full of food and beer, and some gear. I'd done plenty of solo camping before, so I wasn't nervous. I liked the quiet, the isolation. That evening, I ended up staying out on the trail longer than I planned. The light drained from the sky quicker than I expected. By the time I started heading back, the trees were swallowing the last of the orange light. I met a man on the trail, an older local guy who seemed friendly enough. He asked if I was camping and told me about a spot down near the river. He said it was hidden from the road, not an official site, but nice and flat with a good place for a fire. I followed his directions and found it without much trouble. A flat patch of dirt under tall trees, shielded by brush, only a few minutes walk from the main road but completely invisible from it. I parked my truck beside the trees and decided it was good enough for the night. I built a small fire, cracked open a beer, and sat on a log listening to the sound of the river moving in the dark. The air felt heavy, the way it does right before the world goes completely still. I played one of my favorite comedy podcasts on my phone. The volume turned up a little louder than usual since there was no one around to bother. I must have laughed louder than I should have. Between the glow of the fire, the sound of the podcast, and the couple of beers I drank, I felt a little too comfortable, a little too visible. But it was late, and after staring into the fire long enough, I decided I didn't feel like setting up my tent. Instead, I crawled into the back of my truck. I had a topper on it, and my sleeping bag fit fine back there. I tossed a few of my bags inside too, the bear spray and my knife within easy reach just out of habit. I left the fire burning low outside and listened to it crackle through the night as I dozed off. The night passed quietly. At least I think it did. I remember waking up a few times to the sound of the wind moving through the trees, but that was it. When I finally woke up for good, pale light was creeping through the frosted windows of the topper. The air was sharp and cold. I crawled out, stretched my legs, and got a fire going again to warm my hands. I cracked open another beer while I cooked breakfast, eggs and sausage on a small camping stove, the smoke curling up into the cold morning air. It was quiet. No cars, no birds, just the sound of the fire and the river. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, not moving, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face clearly. I thought at first he might have been another camper or someone hiking through, but the longer I looked, the stranger he seemed. He wasn't dressed for camping. He looked filthy, his clothes layered and torn, covered in dirt and leaves. What really caught my eye were the plastic grocery bags. Dozens of them, tied all over his clothes and hanging off his arms. They flapped lightly in the breeze like ribbons. He started walking toward the fire, slow and unsteady. He never looked directly at me, just kind of stared past me or through me, his head tilted down. Something about that made my stomach twist. His beard was long and tangled, and his hair stuck out from under a torn hat. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, and his movements were jerky, almost mechanical. I tried to say something, just a casual greeting, but he didn't respond. He just paced near the edge of my camp, turning in slow circles, kicking at the dirt, and looking down at the ground. His silence made the air feel heavier. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck lift. I remember the fire popping and the smell of breakfast hanging in the air, and how out of place this man looked against it. I tried to offer him something, motioning toward the food, the beer, anything to get a reaction. Nothing. He just stood there, sometimes walking a few steps, then stopping again. His clothes rustled with the sound of all those bags. The situation started to feel wrong in a very quiet way. There was no reason for him to be there. There wasn't another person for miles as far as I knew. And the more I watched him, the more I realized he wasn't lost or confused. He was just there, watching without watching, existing too close to me without any reason. I kept my bear spray close, my hand never far from it. I didn't know if he was dangerous, but I didn't like how unpredictable he felt. The longer he lingered, the more I noticed little things. The way he shuffled his feet without lifting them, the faint smell of rot on the wind, the quiet rasp of his breathing when he was close enough. He wandered in a slow half circle around the fire, never taking his eyes off the ground. I stood frozen, my food untouched, every sound amplified. The river, the wind, the sound of my own heartbeat. He didn't speak, not a single word. At one point, he turned his back to me, facing the trees. He stayed that way for what felt like forever. The stillness of it, the fact that he didn't move or acknowledge me, made it worse than anything else. I finally decided it was enough. I grabbed the bear spray and stepped forward, shouting at him to leave. My voice came out louder than I meant, breaking the silence like a gunshot. He didn't react right away. He just stood there. Then, slowly, he started walking toward the trees. Not fast, not hurried, just drifting away. I didn't take my eyes off him until he disappeared behind the brush. The woods went completely silent after that. No wind, no birds, no river sound. Just the faint hiss of the fire. My pulse was still pounding in my ears. I waited for a while, staring at the tree line, half expecting him to come back. But he didn't. I threw everything into the truck: stove, food, sleeping bag, everything I could grab. I didn't even bother putting the fire out the right way. I just kicked dirt over it, jumped in the truck, and started driving. My heart didn't slow down until I was miles away, back where I could see power lines and pavement again. That drive out of the valley felt longer than it had any right to. The road twisted through the trees, and every time I looked in the mirror, I half expected to see him standing there in the middle of the road. Even now, I think about that morning sometimes. How quiet he was. How strange it felt to have someone standing so close but completely disconnected from the world. I've camped plenty of times since then, but never alone, and never anywhere without cell service. I don't know what his story was, if he was living out there, if he followed me in the night, or if he just wandered through by chance. But the way he moved, the silence, the way he seemed to exist outside of everything, it made something deep inside me go cold. When I think back on it, the scariest part isn't that he could have hurt me. It's that he might have been there the whole night, standing just beyond the firelight, watching. I'll never know if he was, but when I picture that valley now, all I can see is that quiet morning, the man standing at the edge of camp, his plastic bag swaying softly in the cold air, and me sitting there frozen, realizing how easily things could have gone wrong. That was the last time I ever slept in the back of my truck. We went camping deep in the mountains when I was still in high school. It was one of those summer trips that felt endless when we planned it, but once we were out there, everything seemed to blur into exhaustion and quiet. There were 5 of us, just a group of teenagers who wanted to be away from everything. No parents, no teachers, no phones. We packed too much, hiked too far, and by the time we found a place flat enough to set up camp, the sun was already starting to sink behind the ridge. The hike had been brutal. The trail faded halfway up the mountain, and we ended up cutting through dense trees and uneven ground. Every step was uphill, and the air grew thinner as we climbed. The forest was alive with sound. Branches snapping, birds calling from high up, the wind pushing through the leaves like a constant whisper. By the time we stopped, my legs were shaking and my shirt was soaked through with sweat. We dropped our packs and just stood there for a moment, catching our breath. The spot we picked wasn't perfect, but it felt isolated and quiet. There was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with the faint sound of running water somewhere downhill. We set up the tents in a half circle around a fire pit we dug into the dirt. When the fire was finally going, we sat around it, eating whatever we had left that didn't require cooking: trail mix, jerky, and granola bars. The air was cold enough that sitting close to the fire felt like leaning into a wall of heat. By the time we crawled into our tents, everything hurt in that heavy, satisfying way that comes after a long hike. The ground was hard and uneven, but I barely noticed once I zipped myself into the sleeping bag. The forest was quiet now, except for the soft crack of the dying fire and the faint rustle of the trees above. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up in complete darkness. At first, I didn't know why I was awake. It was that kind of quiet where even the usual night sounds, the insects, the breeze, felt muted. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, a faint sound, close to the tent. Something moving through the leaf litter, careful but steady. The sound of something stepping where no one should be stepping. It wasn't a single noise. It came again, then again, from another direction. My whole body went rigid. At first, I thought it was one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom, but the sound didn't match. It wasn't just one person. I could hear movement from more than one spot. Something stepped on a branch. It cracked softly, followed by the whisper of something brushing against the tent fabric. My breathing got shallow. The fire outside had gone out completely, and there was no glow, no light, nothing but darkness pressing against the tent walls. I tried to convince myself it was animals, maybe raccoons or coyotes, but the noises didn't fit. These were heavier, slower, and they seemed deliberate, like something was circling us. Every few seconds, I'd hear a step, then silence, then another from a different spot. It felt like they were moving around the tent in a circle, getting closer each time. I remember lying perfectly still, barely daring to move. The air inside the tent felt thick and suffocating. My mind started racing, replaying every horror story I'd ever heard about people being followed in the woods. There was a sense of weight outside, like the presence of something big, close enough to hear me breathing. For a while, I just listened. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears and the faint sound of something brushing against the dry grass outside. Then I heard another soft step, almost right beside my head, and I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking. The zipper of the tent felt impossibly loud as I opened it just enough to stick my arm out. The night was so dark that the light seemed swallowed up at first, like it wasn't strong enough to cut through it. Then, as the beam steadied, it caught something. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing back at me from the darkness. The light reflected off them in a dull, eerie way, large, unblinking, spread out across the trees and brush all around the tent. They were at a height that didn't make sense. Not low to the ground like small animals. These were higher, almost level with where a person's eyes would be. For a split second, I couldn't move. My mind went blank. The light trembled in my hand as I slowly swept it across the clearing, and more eyes appeared. Pairs and pairs of them, silent, still, staring straight toward the tent. I could hear the faint rustle of movement now, the soft crack of twigs as something shifted just beyond the reach of the light. I pulled the flashlight back inside the tent, my heart racing. I sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of it. The silence outside returned, except for an occasional shuffle or the faint sound of breathing carried on the wind. I must have stayed like that for what felt like forever before exhaustion finally pulled me back under. When I woke again, the first light of morning was seeping through the trees. The fear from the night before felt unreal for a moment, like something half-dreamed. But as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the memory came rushing back. The ground was covered in tracks, dozens of them, pressing into the soft dirt all around the campsite. They weren't human, long, narrow, cloven hooves. It hit me then what I'd seen. Deer. A whole herd of them must have come through during the night, probably curious about the smell of food or the faint warmth of the fire. The reflection of my flashlight on their eyes had made them seem so much closer, so much larger. From inside the tent, half awake and surrounded by darkness, it had felt like something completely different. The others were still asleep, snoring softly in their tents, completely unaware of how close I'd been to panicking. The sun was climbing slowly above the trees, burning away the mist that clung to the ground. The forest looked calm again, peaceful even. Birds started to call from the branches, and the cold air felt lighter. As I walked around the campsite, I followed the tracks a little way into the brush. There were dozens of prints leading down the slope toward the stream, where the ground was softer. They'd come close, very close, to where we'd been sleeping and then moved on, probably just passing through. I stood there for a long time, listening to the forest wake up. The fear I'd felt during the night seemed ridiculous in the light of morning, but part of me still felt that leftover unease. It's strange how different the woods feel when it's dark. The same trees, the same air, but at night, every sound seems sharper, every shadow alive. When everyone finally woke up, we made breakfast over the rekindled fire and joked about how quiet the night had been. I didn't say much about what happened. It felt pointless to explain how close I'd come to losing it over a group of deer. But even now, years later, I can still remember how it felt lying there in that tent. How heavy the silence was, how loud each breath sounded, and how the darkness seemed to press against the thin fabric like something alive. I know now that it was just deer, but in that moment, surrounded by invisible movement and glowing eyes at human height, it felt like something far worse. It taught me something about how quickly fear can twist the ordinary into something terrifying. That trip became just another memory of our high school years, but that night stayed with me. Every time I camp alone now, when the woods fall silent and the dark feels endless, I still find myself listening for footsteps outside the tent, waiting for the sound of something circling just beyond the light. I don't know why I ever thought camping alone was a good idea. Maybe it was the need to clear my head, to get away from everything for a few days. Life in the city had been wearing me down. Noise, people, traffic, always something. I thought a few nights under the trees would reset me. That was my mistake. It was early September when I packed up my gear and drove out toward a provincial park in northern Ontario. The plan was simple: hike a few miles off the main trail, set up camp by one of the lakes, spend 3 nights, then head home. I'd gone camping before, but always with friends. This time I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone with nothing but the sound of the woods. The road into the park turned into gravel after about an hour, winding through thick pine forest. I parked near an old logging trail and hiked in with my pack. The air smelled sharp, like sap and wet dirt. The farther I walked, the quieter it got. No engines, no voices, just wind moving through branches. I remember thinking it felt peaceful, almost cleansing. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low and the surface of the water was still. I found a small clearing on a rise above the shore, cleared a spot for my tent, and started gathering wood. It felt like I was the only person within miles. That isolation made me feel strangely powerful at first, like I'd found something pure again. But that feeling didn't last. The first sign that something was off came around dusk. I was sitting by the fire, watching the light fade across the water, when I noticed a shape far down the opposite bank. It looked like a person standing just at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the reflection of a tree or a rock. But when I squinted, I was sure it moved. I watched for a while, and the shape didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, still as a post, until darkness swallowed it up completely. I tried to brush it off. Maybe another camper, maybe a hiker passing through. But I hadn't seen any vehicles parked near the trailhead, and I hadn't passed anyone on the way in. Still, I told myself it was fine. People camp in the same areas all the time. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little sound in the forest seemed closer than it should have been. The snapping of twigs, the rustle of leaves. I barely slept. When I got up in the morning, the first thing I did was walk down to the lake to see if there were any footprints or signs of someone being across the water. The mud near the edge was smooth, undisturbed. No tracks, no ashes from a fire, nothing. I hiked a few miles that day to explore, trying to push the weirdness out of my head. But even in daylight, the woods felt heavy. There was this constant sense of being followed, though I never saw anyone. The deeper I went, the more I noticed small things that didn't fit. Broken branches at shoulder height, disturbed patches of moss, even what looked like a freshly cut piece of bark on one of the trees. It felt like someone had been there not long before me. By the time I got back to camp, I was uneasy. I told myself to eat, get some rest, and pack up early in the morning. That night, the sound came. It started slow, a faint crunching, like someone walking on the pine needles near the edge of camp. I froze in my sleeping bag and listened. The sound would stop, then start again, closer each time. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But the steps were too steady, too deliberate. When I finally sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to peek through, I didn't see anything. The fire had burned low, just red coals glowing faintly. But the woods beyond them were completely still, and that stillness felt wrong. It wasn't the calm silence of nature. It was the kind of silence where even the animals are quiet because something else is there. I waited for a long time before lying back down. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I must have dozed off. When I woke up just before sunrise, I felt a jolt of panic before I even opened my eyes. The first thing I noticed was that the fire had been rebuilt. I'd let it die out before sleeping, but now it was burning low again, like someone had added fresh wood. The smell of smoke was strong. I stumbled out of the tent, heart pounding. There were footprints in the dirt near the pit, boot prints, not mine. They circled the camp once, then disappeared into the trees toward the trail. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing. No voices, no movement. Whoever it was had already gone. That was enough for me. I packed up as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. I wanted to be out of there before whoever it was came back. The hike back to my truck felt endless. Every sound made me spin around, certain I'd see someone behind me. When I finally reached the road, I threw my gear in the back seat and got in. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. The drive out felt like escaping something invisible that might still be following me. It wasn't until I was an hour down the highway that I started to breathe normally again. I pulled over at a gas station and just sat there for a while, staring at the dashboard, realizing how close that could have gone wrong. When I got home, I couldn't stop replaying the details. The figure across the lake, the rebuilt fire, the footprints. I thought about how quietly someone would have to move to do all that without waking me up. I even checked my pack and my truck for anything missing, but everything was there. Whoever it was hadn't taken anything. They'd just been there. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound in my apartment made me jump. I kept thinking about what their plan had been. Were they watching to see if I was alone? Were they waiting for me to fall asleep completely? Did something interrupt them before they could do whatever they'd come for? The scariest part wasn't what happened. It was what didn't. The fact that I'd been completely vulnerable, deep in the woods, and someone had walked into my camp, stood a few feet from me, and then left without a trace. Now, whenever someone mentions going camping, I just shake my head. I can't explain it without sounding paranoid, but that trip changed the way I see the woods. I used to love that silence, the clean smell of pine and dirt. Now it feels like a trap, like an open stage where anything can walk in and you wouldn't know until it was right in front of you. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how easy it would have been for whoever was out there to do whatever they wanted. No witnesses, no signal, no one for miles. They didn't even have to rush. They could have sat by my fire, watched me sleep, walked away, and I'd never have known. It's strange how something so small, just footprints, a burning fire, a shape across the water, can stick with you. It's been years now, but I still haven't gone back to the woods. If I learned anything from that trip, it's that there's a difference between being alone and being isolated. Alone feels peaceful. Isolated feels like something's watching, waiting for you to realize how far away help really is. That's the part that still gets me. The realization that I didn't even hear them come or go. That I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. Every time I think back to that night, the only thing that comes to mind is simple and clear. It was around 2 in the morning when it happened. The kind of deep, heavy darkness that swallows everything. The fire had burned down low, just a few flickering orange embers left glowing in the circle of stones we built earlier that evening. We were camping far out in the woods, miles from any town, surrounded by thick forest that seemed endless in every direction. The air had that heavy, cold stillness that only happens in the middle of the night. Every sound felt sharper, every movement louder. We'd spent the whole day hiking and setting up camp beside a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The ground there was soft with pine needles, and a creek ran somewhere nearby, close enough to hear but too far to see in the dark. It had been a quiet day, one of those long summer evenings where everything slows down as the sun fades. We made a small fire, cooked whatever food we brought, and sat around telling stories until exhaustion started to sink in. By the time midnight passed, everyone had gone quiet. The fire was dying, and the cold was settling in. I remember sitting there staring into the fire, watching the last bits of wood glow red before they crumbled into ash. The light from the fire barely reached beyond a few feet, and everything past that line was just black. The trees looked like silhouettes pressed against the darkness, unmoving and endless. My friends were half asleep, wrapped in blankets, the sound of their slow breathing blending into the low crackle of the fire. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the woods. It wasn't loud at first, just a soft movement, like something brushing against the dry leaves. I thought maybe it was the wind, but there wasn't any breeze that night. The trees were still, the air completely still. Then the sound came again, closer this time. It was the kind of sound that makes your whole body tense up before your mind even understands what it is. It came from the darkness beyond the firelight, where nothing could be seen. It wasn't big or heavy, but it was deliberate. Something was moving out there. We all heard it. Even the ones who had started to doze off lifted their heads, their eyes reflecting the firelight. The sound of the rustling moved again, circling just beyond the light. It was steady, almost cautious. I felt my pulse quicken as I turned on my flashlight, aiming it toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off the trunks of trees and wet leaves, but there was nothing there. Just the sound, soft, persistent. Another light flicked on beside me, then another. 3 or 4 narrow beams of white light scanned the woods, cutting across each other. The forest floor came into view. Twigs, rocks, bits of moss, and still that sound. Closer now, coming from somewhere just ahead. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on all of us at once. The fire cracked softly, sending sparks upward, and for a moment everything was perfectly still. Then out of nowhere, something small burst from the darkness. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. A flash of movement, a blur of fur, and before anyone could even process what was happening, it ran straight into the campfire. There was a faint squeal, a sharp, horrible sound, followed immediately by the hiss and crackle of burning flesh. The smell hit next, an acrid, sickening scent that cut through the cold air. For a moment, nobody moved. The sound of sizzling filled the silence, and I could see the tiny shape twisting in the flames, its body catching the light as it burned. It was over in seconds, but those seconds felt endless. Took a moment before my brain could even understand what I'd just seen. A mole, small, round, blind little creature, had come charging out of the woods and straight into the fire like it was running from something it couldn't escape. The sound it made was sharp and short, then gone. All that was left was the faint crackling of the fire and a thin trail of smoke rising from the ashes. For a long time, none of us spoke or moved. The fire hissed softly as one of the remaining pieces of wood collapsed inward. The smell lingered in the cold night air, mixed with the smoky scent of the campfire. My stomach turned at the sight of the small blackened body resting in the coals. The light from the fire made it look unreal, like something that shouldn't have happened. After a while, I couldn't take my eyes off it. My flashlight beam caught the edges of the tiny body, the fur completely gone, the shape barely recognizable. There was no way to make sense of it. Why it ran that way, why it went straight for the fire instead of around it, I couldn't figure it out. Animals usually avoid light, noise, people. But this one had done the opposite. It had come charging toward us, straight into the fire like it had no other choice. The sound of the woods slowly returned after that. Crickets started up again. A few leaves rustled in the distance. The others went quiet, lying back down eventually, but I stayed awake. I couldn't stop replaying the image in my head. The flash of movement, the sound, the smell. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise in the woods after that made my heart jump, even though I knew whatever had happened was over. When the sun finally rose, everything looked different. The same clearing, the same trees, but the air felt lighter. The fire had gone out completely, leaving behind gray ash and a faint ring of smoke rising in the cold morning air. The mole's body was still there, charred and small, half buried in the ashes. Seeing it in daylight made it feel even stranger. There was something deeply unsettling about how it looked, like the life had been drained out of something so innocent and small. None of us said much that morning. The woods were quiet again, and even the birds seemed to keep their distance. We decided to bury the little thing before we packed up. It felt wrong to just leave it there. We found a soft patch of earth near the edge of the clearing, where the soil was loose and dark. Using a small trowel, we dug a shallow hole. The ground was cool and damp, and the smell of earth mixed with the faint scent of smoke still clinging to our clothes. When we lifted the tiny burned body from the ashes with a stick and placed it in the hole, it barely seemed real. It was just a small, lifeless thing, but the weight of what had happened hung over all of us. We covered it gently with dirt and laid a small flat stone over the spot. Nobody said anything for a while. There wasn't anything to say. It was just one of those things that happens out in the wilderness that you can't explain or forget. The rest of the morning passed quietly. We cleaned up the camp, packed our gear, and started the long hike back toward the trail. The forest was bright now, filled with light and sound, but it still felt different. I kept thinking about that mole, about the way it ran straight into the flames. Maybe it was sick, or maybe something had chased it. Or maybe it was just confused, blinded by the firelight, disoriented in the dark. Whatever it was, it left a strange heaviness behind. That night stayed with me for a long time. It wasn't the kind of memory that fades easily. Sometimes when I sit by a campfire now and watch the embers glow in the dark, I think about that little mole. The way it appeared so suddenly, the way the whole forest seemed to hold its breath in that moment, the sound of the fire swallowing it up. It was quick, senseless, and unforgettable. It reminded me how wild nature really is, how unpredictable, how fragile. Out there, everything is raw and real. Things live, things die, sometimes for no reason at all. The woods don't explain themselves. They just keep going. We left that clearing behind that morning, but the image of that small creature in the fire stayed burned into my memory. It was one of those moments that makes you realize how small you are out there, how quickly something can happen, and how strange and cruel the natural world can be even in its silence. That trip became one of those stories we never really told anyone else. It wasn't funny, and it wasn't the kind of memory you share lightly. It just sat there in the back of my mind, a reminder of that dark, quiet night in the woods when the fire burned low, and something small and helpless came running out of the blackness, straight into the light. I went camping alone in a small patch of bushland a few hours outside of town. It wasn't a campground, just a secluded area off a dirt road that I'd found once while driving around. There was a narrow trail that led through dry eucalyptus trees and dense brush before it opened into a small clearing. It was quiet out there, far from everything. No houses, no farms, no lights. I liked that about it. When you're surrounded by dry leaves, sticks, and bark, you can hear everything. Every step, every movement, every animal that brushes through the grass. That night, I thought that would make me feel safe, since I'd be able to hear anything approaching. The day had been warm and windy, but by late evening, the air had cooled down and the bush had gone still. I parked my old SUV near a cluster of trees and set up my tent a few meters away. The ground was uneven and covered in leaf litter, but I cleared enough of a spot for the small tent and got a little fire going before it got too dark. There was no signal on my phone, no sound of cars, no planes overhead, just the soft rush of wind through the trees and the occasional crack of dry branches somewhere deeper in the bush. Once the fire settled into a steady glow, I made a simple meal, canned beans and sausage heated over a small burner, and sat by the flames for a while. The smell of eucalyptus was strong, mixed with smoke and dust. I had one beer and watched the sparks rise into the dark. I remember thinking how empty everything felt out there. It was peaceful, but in a way that almost made you feel exposed, like the silence was too big. When I finally crawled into my tent, it was sometime around 10. I zipped the flap closed, slid into my sleeping bag, and listened for a bit before drifting off. The night was so quiet that even the small rustle of my own movement sounded loud. The ground outside was dry and brittle, covered in a thick layer of leaves and twigs, and I could hear the occasional crack as small animals moved around. Probably possums or bandicoots, the kind of harmless noise you get used to when you camp alone. At some point during the night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't to the usual sounds of the bush, it was different. I heard a faint plop sound from outside, not loud, but distinct enough that it cut through the quiet. It was strange because it didn't match the usual rustle or snap you hear out there. It wasn't a stick breaking or leaves shifting. It was heavier, softer, like something solid had dropped onto the ground close to the tent. I lay there for a while, completely still, listening. The bush was silent. No movement, no crickets, nothing. Just that ringing kind of quiet you only hear when something nearby has disturbed the natural sounds. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to. I listened for footsteps or rustling, but there was nothing else. The silence stretched on until I convinced myself it might have been a branch falling or maybe a piece of bark dropping from a tree. After a few minutes, I managed to fall back asleep, though not deeply. Every small sound after that made me open my eyes again. The air had gotten colder, and I remember pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me and trying not to think about how empty the dark felt outside. When the first light started to creep through the tent fabric, I was already half awake. The air was cool and damp, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. I lay there for a minute, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. Then I unzipped the flap and stuck my head out. The light was gray and soft, filtering through the trees. The fire was out, just a pile of cold ash and half-burned wood. Everything looked normal at first glance until I turned to my left. A few feet from the tent, resting on the ground beside the flap, was a kangaroo's head. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was looking at. It was just there, perfectly still, half covered in dirt and leaves. The fur was matted with blood that had already darkened, and the edges of the neck were rough and torn. The eyes were open. It hadn't been there the night before when I set up my tent. I was sure of it. There was no way I would have missed something like that. My stomach turned instantly. I felt cold all over. The first thing that came to mind was that someone or something had brought it there during the night. I scanned the clearing slowly, looking for movement, for tracks, for anything that made sense. The ground was littered with leaves and sticks, but there were no clear footprints, just the usual scuffs and indentations that could have been from animals, but nothing that told me who or what had done this. The strangest part was how quiet it was again. The bush was dead still. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just that heavy silence pressing in from all sides. I stood there frozen, my breath clouding the air. The sight of that head so close to where I'd been sleeping made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if it was fresh or old, but the blood around it looked like it had been there for a few hours, maybe from the night before. I started thinking about the sound I'd heard. The plop. That must have been it. That's when it had landed there. Someone or something had dropped it next to my tent while I was sleeping. That realization hit hard. Whatever had done it had been close enough to touch the tent, close enough to see me through the thin fabric. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard breathing, hadn't heard a single thing other than that one sound. My hands were shaking as I packed up. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I just threw my sleeping bag, gear, and everything else into the back of the SUV as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees watching me. There was no one, just the bush, quiet and empty, as if it had swallowed every trace of what happened. When I finally climbed into the driver's seat, I took one last look at the clearing. The tent spot, the dead fire, the pale shape of that kangaroo's head lying in the dirt. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I just left it there. Driving out, the track felt longer than it had the day before. Every shadow between the trees looked wrong. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Who would do something like that? And how had I not heard them? The dry leaves should have crunched under every step. Even a small animal couldn't move quietly out there. But I'd heard nothing. Just that single dull sound in the middle of the night. When I finally reached the main road and saw the first car pass by, I felt my body start to relax for the first time. The normal world felt different after that night. Louder, safer, more solid. I never went back to that spot again. I never even tried to figure out where the nearest house or property was. I just let it go. But sometimes I think about it when I camp alone now. The memory always comes back when the woods go quiet and I'm lying in my tent, listening for anything moving outside. What unsettles me most isn't the sight of that head, or even the thought of someone placing it there. It's the silence that came before and after. Whoever or whatever did that had moved in complete silence through a bed of dry sticks and leaves, close enough to touch my tent, close enough to hear me breathing. That kind of quiet doesn't feel human, and I never want to hear it again. I had always thought I knew what it meant to feel close to nature. I'd spent years camping, guiding, and sleeping out under the stars across the African bush. You learn to tell the difference between the harmless sounds and the dangerous ones. You get used to the noises, the crackle of dry grass, the low grumble of far-off animals, the faint whisper of the wind pushing through thorn trees. You even learn how to sleep lightly, so you're aware of what's moving around you without ever fully waking up. But no amount of experience prepares you for the feeling of something enormous lying against you in the middle of the night. That night had been cold, colder than usual for the Lowveld, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. During the day, the air had been hot and dusty, the sun burning through the grass until everything looked washed out and brittle. But once the light faded, the temperature dropped hard. We had finished a long day guiding a small group of guests and were camping out in a private part of the reserve, far from any lodges or electric lights. It was just us, 2 small tents, a dying campfire, and the endless quiet that comes with the wild. By the time I crawled into my tent, my fingers were stiff from the cold. I zipped myself deep into my sleeping bag, trying to trap what little warmth I had. The fabric of the tent felt icy whenever it brushed my skin. I'd been in worse conditions before, but that night felt sharp in a way that made me pull my jacket tighter and bury my face into the bag. The air smelled faintly of dust, smoke, and the dry sweetness of acacia wood that had burned in our fire. Sometime in the early hours, when the sky was still pitch black, I woke up. It wasn't because of a sound or movement, just that strange, instinctive feeling that something is different. I was lying on my side, my back pressed against the thin canvas wall of the tent. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Then I realized how warm that spot felt. Not just a little warm, radiating heat, slow and steady, like leaning against another body. The warmth was so surprising that it didn't register as wrong at first. In the freezing air, it felt good, even comforting. My brain didn't catch up right away. I remember thinking how strange it was that the warmth was only on one side of me. Then I noticed the shape of the tent wall, pushed inward slightly, rounded and heavy, as though something was pressed up against it from the outside. That was when I stopped breathing for a few seconds. The warmth wasn't just there. I could feel it move, the slow rhythm of it, rising and falling in a pattern that could only be breathing. Deep, heavy breaths that came from something much larger than any person. The realization crawled through me slowly. Something alive was lying against the tent, using it as shelter from the cold. I stayed perfectly still. Every instinct told me not to move, not even to adjust the sleeping bag. I could hear the faint scrape of my heartbeat in my own ears. The fabric against my back shivered slightly with each breath of the thing outside. I could feel the weight of it through the ground, a low, dense pressure. For a few minutes, I lay there trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that maybe it was one of the camp dogs from the nearby lodge that had wandered over. But then I remembered where we were. Miles from any fence, in the middle of true wilderness. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything small. I thought about all the animals that might move through the area at night. Hyenas, leopards, buffalo, maybe even elephants. But none of them fit the feeling of what was pressed against me. It wasn't rough or hard. It felt like muscle under fur. A slow-moving weight, not pushing, just leaning. The cold air outside was silent. I couldn't even hear insects, which made the world feel frozen in place. Then, faintly, I heard a sound, soft at first, then clearer. A low, rumbling vibration that I could feel through the ground and through the fabric of the tent. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was a purr. That sound went straight through me. It was deep and smooth, like distant thunder. I'd heard it before, but never that close. Never so close I could feel it in my spine. Every muscle in my body locked up. The warmth on my back wasn't just any animal. It was a lion. It took everything I had not to panic. I tried to think rationally, but my thoughts were scattered, tumbling over one another. Lions often rest near camps at night because of the faint warmth or smell of humans. They're curious, not immediately aggressive. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to breathe normally when I could feel the weight of one against my tent. I thought about the stories other guides had told me, how lions sometimes lie near the fire or brush against tents, drawn by the heat. They usually move off before dawn. Usually. But there I was, lying in the dark, feeling its breath through the canvas, realizing just how thin that barrier really was. The only thing separating me from a full-grown predator was a few millimeters of fabric and my own stillness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My breath fogged up the inside of the sleeping bag. I could hear my heartbeat thudding against the nylon. The lion didn't move much. Every few seconds, I could feel a tiny vibration through the tent as it exhaled. I wondered if it could hear me breathing, if it knew I was awake. I didn't want to give it any reason to shift, to test what was inside the shape it was leaning against. At one point, I shifted slightly, just a small movement to ease the cramp in my leg, and immediately felt the warmth beside me tense. The shape pressed harder against the tent. The breath quickened for a few seconds, and a low, short grunt came from it, deep and heavy. Then silence again. My throat felt dry. I didn't dare move again. Eventually, after what must have been an hour, I felt the weight start to lift. Slowly, the warmth pulled away, and the canvas eased back into place. I heard a faint shuffling sound, soft paws against dirt, moving away from the tent. Then, just once, that low exhale again, followed by footsteps fading into the distance. I stayed still for a long time after that. I didn't even unzip the sleeping bag. The silence felt enormous, almost too big for the space I was in. Only when the first faint light of dawn started bleeding into the sky did I finally sit up. My entire back was damp with sweat despite the cold. I pushed open the tent flap carefully, the early morning air cutting into my face. The ground outside told the story clearly enough. There were paw prints in the dust, large, heavy, perfect circles. I followed them a few feet away from the tent and saw where the lion had lain down, pressed into the ground, the grass flattened by its weight. You could even see the faint marks where its tail had rested, sweeping lightly against the dirt. The sun was just starting to come up, throwing a pale orange light across the bush. The sky looked washed out and endless. The cold was still sharp, but it felt different now, less biting, more alive. I stood there for a while, staring at the tracks, realizing how close I had been to something that could have ended me in a second. It's strange how moments like that can change how you think about the wild. I've spent my whole career around lions, tracking them, studying them, explaining their behavior to guests. But being that close, with nothing but canvas between us, made me see them differently. They aren't just dangerous animals. They're creatures trying to survive the same way everything else does. That lion hadn't been hunting or attacking. It had just wanted warmth. The same thing I had been chasing all night. I packed up camp later that morning, moving slow, careful not to disturb anything. The tracks led off toward the dry riverbed nearby, already fading under the growing light. As I zipped up the tent for the last time, I couldn't help but smile a little at the absurdity of it. My cat back home used to curl up against my back in the winter, purring quietly, trying to steal some warmth. This time it had just been a much bigger cat, one that could have crushed me if it wanted, but didn't. The wild doesn't care about the thin lines we draw between danger and peace. Out there, sometimes you're just another shape in the cold night, sharing a small patch of warmth with something bigger than yourself. That morning, as I stood there under the pale African sun, I realized that even the most terrifying moments can have a strange kind of grace, because sometimes even a lion just wants to cuddle through the cold. My ex and I used to share the same birthday. It was something we always thought was special. So every year we'd pick a place to camp and celebrate together. For a few years in a row, that place was Ginny Springs in Florida. We both loved the feeling of being outdoors, floating on the river during the day, cooking by a small fire at night, sleeping with the sounds of the woods all around us. It was the kind of trip that always started calm and peaceful. But one year, something happened in the middle of the night that made me realize how easily the woods can make your mind turn against you. That year had been especially humid. The air felt like it was pressing down on you even after sunset. We'd set up our tent under a patch of trees not far from the riverbank, where you could still hear the slow rush of water if you listened closely. The campsite around us was pretty quiet, just a few other groups scattered nearby. During the day, we'd spend hours swimming, watching people float by in tubes, and wandering through the shaded trails that surrounded the springs. The water had been crystal clear as always, that impossible blue color that makes everything look peaceful and still. When night came, the temperature didn't drop much, so the air inside the tent stayed warm and sticky. The smell of the campfire still clung to everything: our clothes, the tent fabric, the air itself. The woods outside buzzed with insects, the sound layering into a constant background hum. It wasn't uncomfortable, just alive. There's something strange about camping like that. You're never truly in silence, but the noise becomes part of the peace. We had gone to bed late, sometime after midnight. The faint light from other camps had disappeared, and the forest felt darker than usual. I remember lying on top of my sleeping bag, unable to sleep, just listening to the crickets. Then, out of nowhere, the sound hit us. A high-pitched, violent scream that sliced through the night like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was so sudden and raw that it made my whole body tense instantly. It wasn't just loud. It had that wild, broken edge that sounded like pure panic and pain. The scream came again, longer this time, followed by a deep, guttural growling noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded close, so close it felt like it was just outside the tent. My brain went straight to the worst possible explanation. It had to be something big, something dangerous. The growl had this deep vibration in it that reminded me of videos I'd seen of mountain lions or big cats in the wild. For a few seconds, I just froze, trying not to breathe too loud. The sounds outside were overlapping now. Growls, quick scuffling movements, the faint rustle of leaves, then silence. Then another shriek. It sounded violent, like something fighting for its life. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The air inside the tent suddenly felt even thicker, like it was closing in. I kept staring at the top of the tent, at the thin layer of mesh that separated us from whatever was outside. In my mind, I pictured 2 mountain lions or maybe a bobcat attacking something. I knew Florida had wildlife, but hearing it that close was completely different from reading about it. Every sound seemed amplified by the dark. The scuffling continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. There was a strange silence that followed, the kind that makes you feel like something is still watching, waiting. I couldn't hear the insects anymore, just that low, vibrating sound that came and went, like distant breathing. After a few long minutes of nothing but that tension, I decided I had to at least see what was happening. The idea of unzipping the tent and stepping out felt impossible, but I could at least look through the mesh ceiling. I moved slowly, every movement feeling loud. My body was stiff from staying still for so long. I stood up carefully inside the tent, my head brushing the fabric, and tilted my flashlight upward just enough to see through the mesh at the dark space outside. At first, I couldn't see anything but the outlines of trees and shadows. The fire we'd had earlier had burned down completely, leaving only a faint orange glow from the coals. I scanned the ground near the edge of the light, expecting to see something huge, an animal crouched or pacing, maybe. The night was still now, too still. I waited, eyes straining to make out shapes. Then, near the edge of the campsite, something small moved. Took me a second to understand what I was looking at. The shape was low to the ground, creeping in short, jerky movements. Then another figure appeared, only a few feet away from it, completely still except for the faint twitch of its tail. The realization hit almost instantly, and I remember feeling both confused and ridiculous at the same time. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't even close. The first animal was a stray house cat, small, thin, and hunched low like it was ready to pounce. The other shape was an armadillo frozen in place, its rounded shell catching bits of the dim light. The cat would take a few steps forward, make that awful screeching noise again, then back up slightly. The armadillo would shuffle just enough to make a dry, rustling sound with its claws against the dirt. The growling I had heard earlier was coming from the cat, though somehow it had sounded 100 times deeper and more threatening when I couldn't see it. For a few seconds, I just stared through the mesh, watching this bizarre standoff. The cat was clearly agitated, probably half feral and unused to seeing something like that armadillo. The armadillo, on the other hand, didn't move much at all. It just held its ground, head low, shell glinting faintly. Every time the cat hissed or let out that blood-curdling scream, the armadillo would twitch but not retreat. Eventually, the cat turned sharply, flicked its tail, and darted off into the brush. The armadillo stayed for a while longer, sniffing around before slowly waddling off in the opposite direction. The woods went quiet again, and the night sounds slowly returned. The insects started chirping like nothing had happened. The whole world seemed to exhale. I stayed standing there for a while, just staring at the empty spot where the two animals had been. My body was still tense, adrenaline still running. I sat back down on my sleeping bag, heart still pounding, but now for a completely different reason. It was such a strange mix of emotions: relief, embarrassment, disbelief. The fear had been so real, so physical, and yet the source of it was something that couldn't have hurt me even if it tried. It made me think about how quickly our senses twist what we don't understand, especially in the dark. The woods are full of small noises, and every one of them has a cause. But when you can't see it, your imagination fills the space with something much worse. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling of the tent again, listening as the night went back to normal. A few leaves rustled overhead, a frog croaked somewhere near the river, and I could hear distant laughter from another campsite far away. The forest felt calm again, but the edge of that fear lingered in my chest, fading slowly. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. In the morning, the sunlight made everything look harmless again. The ground where the standoff had happened showed a few small paw prints and the faint marks from the armadillo's claws. Seeing it in daylight almost made me laugh. The area that had seemed so threatening just hours earlier now looked ordinary. Just a patch of dirt under some trees. We cooked breakfast over the fire and talked about packing up, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd been to convincing myself that something deadly was right outside. That trip stuck with me more than any of the others. It wasn't the danger, because there hadn't really been any. It was how quickly my own mind had built it up into something massive. One sound in the dark had become a mountain lion fight in my head. It reminded me that out in the woods, fear doesn't always come from what's actually there. It comes from what we imagine could be. Even now, years later, every time I hear a cat screech in the night, my heart jumps just a little. For a split second, I'm back in that tent, frozen in the dark, convinced that something wild and dangerous is circling just outside. Then I remember that night at Ginny Springs, and I can almost see the armadillo again, calm and unmoved, standing its ground against a creature 10 times more dramatic than it needed to be. It's funny how one small moment like that can stay burned in your memory, reminding you that sometimes the scariest things are just shadows of your own thoughts.